Hi, I'm Peter Tragos, host of the Lawyer You Know podcast and YouTube channel. The saying goes, everyone hates lawyers until you need one. Well, I'm here when you need one to answer your questions and give you insight that you didn't know you needed. Along with my partners, Pete Sardis, the professor, who has a finance and business background, and George Tragos, my dad, and the consigliere, a criminal defense giant, we can answer any questions you have.
Hi everyone, Pete Sardis for The Lawyer You Know, and we are talking about the Sunny Balwani trial. The evidence is concluded. The closing arguments are done. This case is going to a jury. What I'm going to do today is I want to talk about those closing arguments and what each side argued. I want to do a little bit of compare and contrast between these closing arguments and the Elizabeth Holmes case, and I'm also going to give you some predictions about what the next couple of weeks is probably going to look like. But before we do that, if you enjoy this video, please give me a thumbs up. If you're enjoying this series or any of the other cases that we follow here on The Lawyer You Know, please subscribe to our channel. And as always, if you have questions or comments, leave them down below for me. All right, so let's talk about it. Prosecution closed in about 3.5 hours last week, which is very consistent to what they did in the Elizabeth Holmes case. Again, we've talked about this repeatedly on this series, that the government got a conviction against Elizabeth Holmes. They're going to do everything the same way as much as possible because that is a tried and true method to getting a conviction. So let's speak for a minute about what the government's arguments were to the jury in closing. Number one, the government came right out of the gate and said to the jury, Sunny Balwani is responsible for everything. And how do we know that he's responsible for everything? Well, it's because he sent a text message to Elizabeth Holmes that says, I am responsible for everything. The government then attacked Sunny Balwani's defense, which, if you remember back in their opening arguments, was Sunny Balwani is a victim just like the rest of the investors because he was duped, he lost his money and did not know that the technology was not working. What they said was Sunny Balwani is not a victim. And the reason we know he's not a victim is because Sunny Balwani was the person responsible for the lab, and he was the person who described the lab at Theranos as a disaster zone. Again, an email from him to Elizabeth Holmes. Next topic. The government focused on the revenue representations of Theranos, and they tied Sunny Balwani to that by saying it was Sunny Balwani that told the controller of the company, again, the head accountant, how to put the projections in order for him to be able to solicit investors with those projections. The projections that Sunny Balwani came up with were that in 2014, Theranos was going to have $140 million in revenue, and they were projecting about $1 billion in revenue after that. What the reality was is that in 2014, Theranos brought in about $150,000, and the projections within the company actually showed that the revenue stream was going to be something more like $430,000 on their best day. The next topic that the government focused on was the fact that Sunny Balwani was the day-to-day supervisor of the Theranos lab, and that the lab directors reported directly to him. Now, what was interesting was the government's representation is the only time that Theranos lab directors were asked to validate lab tests that they knew were not accurate or they knew were not reliable was at a time when the company was short on money, and that was the time where Sunny Balwani became agitated and ordered them to put results out, even though he knew that the science was not ready. Again, nothing really inconsistent from what the government did in the Elizabeth Holmes trial. Again, obviously tailored a little bit more towards Sunny Balwani since he is the defendant, but really kind of lockstep right down the line. They talk about the investors, they talk about the patients, they talk about the science, attack Sunny Balwani and the evidence in those specific categories. Now, the defense's representation was a little bit shorter and to the point, a very concise closing, which is the text messages that the government pulls out to show the jury are misleading. It's a misleading picture of Sunny Balwani because what they're doing is they're taking snippets of text messages out of context and reshuffling those text messages to make it fit the government's required timeline to get a conviction. The defense's representation was very different. They said Balwani put his heart and soul into Theranos. He was a true believer in the technology and that he worked tirelessly for years to make Theranos a success. They talked about the fact that his initial investment was about $4.6 million when he came on board as COO, but ultimately had invested about $15 million of his own money into this company. The interesting part was that his stock was worth somewhere about $500 million at some point, and the defense's representation was Sunny Balwani never sold a single share of that stock, never tried to recoup any of his money because he believed in the company so much and he believed that it was going to be successful in the long run. And that was the entirety of the defense's closing argument. Now, let's do a little compare and contrast. We talked about the fact that 3.5-hour closing argument was what we expected to see because that's exactly what the government did in the Elizabeth Holmes trial. Now, they did do some things a little bit differently, and I think they made some decisions that were different simply because they learned a lot in the Elizabeth Holmes trial. The government spent a lot more time tying Sunny Balwani to the lab and the lab to the false results that patients received. They did that because the jury for Elizabeth Holmes acquitted Elizabeth Holmes of any charges against the patients, saying that there was just not enough of a connection between her and the patients to justify a conviction. One of the other things that happened was, if you remember, a number of the jurors in the Elizabeth Holmes case after the verdict came out and spoke publicly saying that the reason they actually convicted Elizabeth Holmes was because she was ultimately responsible for everything in the company because she was the CEO of the entire organization. So again, the government tweaking that information, what they learned, and making it sound as if Sunny Balwani is the person that's actually in charge. That's why we see them focusing on those text messages that says, I am responsible for everything, because they're trying to plant those seeds in the mind of the jury that Sunny Balwani is the person that is actually responsible for everything. He is the person. Elizabeth Holmes was more figurehead than day-to-day operations. He was, in fact, day-to-day operations supervisor and knew exactly what was going on. And I think the government did that because a number of the witnesses that testified both in the Elizabeth Holmes trial and in the Sunny Balwani trial were the patients. And those patients had spoken publicly saying they just didn't feel like the government had spent enough time developing the counts against Elizabeth Holmes relating to those patients, and that's why they were lost. They also felt a little slighted because they felt as if people that lost money were more important than the people whose actual medical life decisions were affected. So I think the government did tailor a little bit of their presentation to the jury to make sure that the victims felt at least validated, for nothing more, or vindicated, depending on how you look at it, and that they were able to make a more direct tie between Sunny Balwani and those patients' experiences with what happened to them. Either got false results, they thought they were going to have to abort a child, things like that. Okay, so what happens now? The judge is going to give the jury their final instructions, and he's going to send them out. At which point, in the federal system especially, the jury is completely in control of everything from that point forward. They're going to go back, they're going to be told the first thing they need to do is appoint a foreperson. That foreperson's responsibility is to speak for the jury as a whole. They will go back there, and at that point, they can literally do whatever they want in order to evaluate the facts as they received them and come to a conclusion, come to a verdict on all of the counts. What I would expect you're going to see is that most juries in criminal cases that are this complex will take the time to actually systematically go through all of the evidence that's gone back into the jury room. They will also take time to systematically discuss all of the testimony that came through the witnesses. And at that point, you may see some questions come back from the jury. And I expect that questions will come back from this jury because they came back in the Elizabeth Holmes case. And from my experience, when you have a case that's this complicated, you will have questions from lay jurors wanting to have clarification on certain legal issues. I'm expecting that that is going to happen over the next few days. How long do we think this is going to take? Honestly, your guess is as good as mine. From experience, I would expect that this is going to take a few days at the least, maybe a week or so at the most. And that really will depend on how this specific jury goes through the evidence in the case. What I mean by that is Some juries are very organized, and there are people that are obvious leaders and they've taken notes and they've got everything kind of itemized and they lead the discussion. Some jurors just kind of sit back and listen to what the strong voice is saying. They kind of come to a conclusion either on their own or by osmosis based on what they're hearing from the other jurors. So depending on what the makeup of this jury is will dictate how they go through their deliberations. Again, there's no rules. They can do it however they want to do it. The only rule, to be fair, is that they have to deliberate together. They cannot have meetings. They cannot discuss evidence. They cannot discuss the case unless all of the jurors are present at the same time. That's the only rule. But beyond that, they can draw straws. They can throw darts at the wall. They can do what they want. All right, let's do some predictions. Elizabeth Holmes' case actually was very surprising to me. I knew that the government was going to have convictions, and they did get those convictions, but I was surprised that the jury split the case by a series of counts for the investors, for guilties, a series of hung counts, and a series of not guilty counts towards the patients. Where I'm expecting this to go is I'm expecting a conviction. Let me be clear about that. I believe that Sunny Balwani will be convicted of something based on what we've seen over the course of the last 13 weeks. I think there is enough evidence to demonstrate that he took steps that he knew were false and misleading in order to either get investors to invest money, get the accountants to fudge the numbers, get the lab directors to validate results that they knew were not legitimate. So I think that there's enough to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that those things occurred. What I don't know is, will the jury place the fraud solely on his head? And what I mean by that is, it's either going to be a case where Sunny Balwani gets hit harder than Elizabeth Holmes because the government tweaked their prosecution to make sure that they hit the points where they lost in Elizabeth Holmes against Sunny Balwani, so they have a better chance of prosecution. Now, again, does it really matter if the jury convicts him of 1 count or 6 counts or 2 counts and says that he's not guilty on the rest? Not really, because the way the federal system works, once they've procured a count of conviction, all of the other evidence that came into the case is going to be relevant conduct. So really, the government only really needs 1 count to convict and send Sunny Balwani to prison. So we shall see how this goes. I think that Sunny Balwani, there's a part of me at least I should say, that thinks that Sunny Balwani could get a worse deal than Elizabeth Holmes, because there's a very good chance that the government's tweaking of their case will get the convictions on all counts, at which point Sunny Balwani now looks to be in a far worse position than Elizabeth Holmes. Now, the opposite is possibly true also. The jury could look at this and say, he's the COO. He didn't start the company. He lost a bunch of his own money. He could have been out when he saw that the stuff was going south, taken $500 million and walked away, but he didn't. He stayed and he fought forward and he kept trying to make the company better. Is it possible? Of course it is. Could they split the baby? Yes, they can. But I'm curious to hear what you all think about this topic. Again, I may be an attorney that does this for a living, but at the same time, you guys are watching the evidence the same way I am, and ultimately, lay people are making the decisions between guilt and acquittal. So your representations, your thoughts are just as valid as mine. So please let me know below. What do you think? Do you think Sunny Balwani is going to be convicted of some counts? And if so, which counts? Do you think he'll be convicted against the counts for the investors? Do you think he'll be convicted about the counts regarding the doctors, the physicians? Do you think he'll be convicted on the counts regarding the patients? Your thoughts, please let me know. Secondly, do you think that this jury is going to come back quickly, or do you think they're going to spend a lot of time kind of dicing through all of this evidence to come to a conclusion? So what is your guess? Do you think a couple days? Do you think a week? Do you think we'll have a verdict this week? Do you think it'll be next week? Please let me know your thoughts, and we will follow this. As soon as we have a verdict, we will come back and we'll talk to you about it. But for now, if you enjoyed this video, give me a thumbs up. If you've enjoyed this series, please subscribe to our channel. And as always, leave me your questions and especially your comments below, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for watching this episode of The Lawyer You Know. If you like this content, please share it with your friends. Make sure you subscribe to our page and like our videos. If you want some interaction, get in the comments and we'll be sure to get back to you. If you want to know any more information about our firm or this page, you can find out in the description or visit tragoslaw.com. We post multiple times throughout the week, so make sure you hit that bell so you can get the notification and not miss out on the next episode.